Welcome to A Journey in Perception, where we dive deep into the world's most impactful stories, bringing fresh insights and lessons from the books that shape our thinking. Today, we're uncovering the jaw-dropping tale behind one of the biggest financial scandals in history, with the Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff, and the death of trust. This book takes you inside the mind of Bernie Madoff, the mastermind behind a $65 billion Ponzi scheme that fooled the financial elite, celebrities, and everyday people alike. How did one man deceive so many for so long? And what does his story teach us about trust, greed, and the fragility of the systems we rely on? At A Journey in Perception, we not only tell powerful stories, but also extract valuable lessons you can apply in your own life. Stay with us until the end as we unravel the lies, betrayal, and the devastating fallout of a scandal that shook the world, and discover what it means for the future of trust in an increasingly complex world. We'll also be uncovering tips and strategies that will help you avoid falling victim to Ponzi schemes and financial scams, ensuring you're always one step ahead. Chapter 1: An Earthquake on Wall Street. This chapter opens on a cold, blustery December day in 2008, a moment that will forever be etched in the minds of those who trusted Bernie Madoff with their wealth. The once celebrated financier, operating out of his prestigious Manhattan office in the Lipstick Building, faced an overwhelming crisis. For decades, Madoff had maintained a near-magical aura of success, consistently delivering remarkable returns to his investors. But now, the empire was crumbling. The financial world was blindsided by what would become the biggest fraud in history. Madoff had been running a Ponzi scheme, using new investors' money to pay off old ones. It wasn't just small-time investors who were caught off guard. Global banks, celebrities, and even charitable organizations had poured their money into what seemed like a foolproof investment. When it all unraveled, billions of dollars vanished, and lives were shattered. Madoff's fraud wasn't just a financial disaster, it was a personal one for those who trusted him implicitly. The first chapter serves as a wake-up call to us all about the dangers of blind trust in financial systems that seem untouchable. The sense of betrayal was palpable as victims realized that their life savings were gone in a flash, along with the illusion of security they had relied on for years. Some key lessons here are: be wary of consistent, high returns. A hallmark of Ponzi schemes is the promise of stable, unusually high returns, even in volatile markets. No investment is immune to market conditions, and any promise of risk-free, high rewards should immediately raise suspicions. Diversify your portfolio, and always question the sustainability of returns that seem too good to be true. Chapter 2: Becoming Bernie. Chapter 2 takes us back in time, tracing the origins of Bernie Madoff's rise to prominence. It's here that we begin to see how a seemingly ordinary man could rise to the heights of Wall Street, only to fall into infamy. Born in Queens, New York, Bernie started out as a lifeguard, using the money he earned to launch a small trading firm in the early 1960s. His early years were filled with ambition and an intense desire to prove himself. From these humble beginnings, Bernie's charm and keen understanding of market opportunities helped him build a reputation as a successful broker. He was an early pioneer in using technology to improve trading efficiency, playing a significant role in the development of NASDAQ, which further bolstered his credibility in the financial world. As his influence grew, so did his list of clients, many of whom trusted him implicitly. But beneath this veneer of success lay a darker side. Even in his early years, Bernie's need to maintain a flawless image led him to engage in questionable practices. In 1962, he covered up substantial losses that his clients suffered, marking the beginning of his long journey of deceit. From these early acts of dishonesty, Bernie became accustomed to bending the rules, setting the stage for his eventual transformation into one of history's most notorious fraudsters. So, what can we take away from this? Don't let charisma cloud your judgment. Bernie's early success wasn't just about technical skill. It was also about his charm and ability to build relationships. Scammers often rely on personal connections and their ability to make you feel like you're part of something special. Always focus on the facts and performance metrics, not the personality behind them. Now onto Chapter 3, The Hunger for Yield. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the desire for consistently high returns among investors had reached a fever pitch. In Chapter 3, we explore how Bernie Madoff expertly tapped into this hunger. The financial markets were becoming more unpredictable, and investors, ranging from individuals to massive institutions, sought refuge in a figure they believed could deliver the stability they craved. Madoff was that figure. He promised steady, consistent returns, even when the markets were volatile, which attracted a wide variety of clients. These clients included some of the most respected names in finance and philanthropy. His investors ranged from billionaires like Carl Shapiro to global banking institutions. For many, Madoff's investment advisory business became synonymous with safety, reliability, and profit. Investors were so captivated by his seemingly magical ability to avoid losses that they ignored the warning signs, choosing instead to believe in the dream of risk-free success. This chapter also reveals how Madoff took advantage of his investors' lack of scrutiny. He masterfully leveraged the psychology of trust, cultivating an image of exclusivity. Potential investors believed they were lucky to be allowed into his circle, reinforcing their blind faith in his strategy. As money flowed in, Madoff used new investors' cash to pay returns to older investors, a textbook example of a Ponzi scheme. But as Madoff's operations grew, so did the pressure to maintain the illusion. With billions under management, he was constantly walking a tightrope, using deception to stave off collapse. The very hunger for yield that attracted his clients also blinded them to the risks they were taking, making it easier for Madoff to perpetuate his fraud. Some important lessons here are: don't chase returns without understanding the risks. Investors in Madoff's fund were so focused on the returns that they overlooked the warning signs, such as a lack of transparency about the investment strategy. Understand the risk profile of every investment you make and be skeptical of those that promise stability in all market conditions. Ensure you have clear access to documentation that verifies where your money is being placed and how it is being used. Chapter 4: The Big Four. In this chapter, we get an inside look at how Bernie Madoff was able to sustain his fraudulent empire with the help of a tight inner circle. The people who either knowingly or unknowingly helped him maintain the illusion of legitimacy. These Big Four were more than just employees. They were confidants and key players who had access to Madoff's inner workings. The chapter introduces us to key figures like Frank DePascali, Bernie's right-hand man on the infamous 17th floor of the Lipstick Building. This floor, hidden away from the rest of the firm's operations, was where the true nature of Madoff's scam played out. DePascali oversaw the fictitious trades that convinced investors that their money was growing. He was the keeper of Madoff's secrets, fabricating financial records, and managing the day-to-day operations of the Ponzi scheme. Then there was Daniel Bonvanter, head of operations, who managed the books and was responsible for covering up the discrepancies between the actual brokerage operations and the fake investment advisory business. Bonvanter helped Madoff's deception go undetected for years by manipulating financial reports. Madoff's younger brother, Peter, was another crucial figure. As chief compliance officer, Peter Madoff should have been the gatekeeper, ensuring the firm's operations were above board. But he either turned a blind eye or was utterly clueless about the massive fraud happening under his nose. Finally, there was David Kugel, a longtime trader who, although not deeply involved in the Ponzi scheme, helped design strategies that allowed Madoff to hide his tracks early on. These four individuals, along with others working in the shadows, were instrumental in allowing Madoff to maintain the appearance of legitimacy. Together, they formed the foundation of the deception that allowed the Ponzi scheme to survive. Madoff's ability to compartmentalize operations, keeping most employees unaware of the fraud, while ensuring that key figures like DePascali and Bonvanter remained loyal, was masterful. Beware of unchecked power and lack of oversight. In Madoff's case, his close-knit inner circle allowed him to evade scrutiny for years. Always ensure that there are checks and balances in place for anyone managing money, especially in financial firms. A lack of transparency and proper oversight can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Chapter 5: The Cash Spigot. Now we dive deeper into the mechanics of how Madoff's Ponzi scheme functioned day to day, specifically focusing on the cash spigot, the endless flow of funds that kept the entire operation alive. Madoff's business wasn't built on profits from legitimate investments. Instead, it relied entirely on the continuous influx of new money from investors. The cash spigot was always running, and as long as new money kept pouring in, Madoff's scheme could sustain itself. Madoff managed to create an illusion of stability and reliability, which made it easy for him to attract new clients. One of the key elements of his success was his ability to keep his clients in the dark about how he was generating returns. Investors didn't question the miraculous consistency of their returns, and Madoff skillfully cultivated an aura of exclusivity. He made his clients feel lucky to be a part of his operation, which made them even less likely to ask difficult questions. Madoff preyed on the fact that people were less likely to investigate financial operations they deemed prestigious and successful. His secrecy and refusal to allow external audits only added to the mystique. What investors didn't realize was that their money wasn't being invested at all. It was simply being used to pay off other investors who had requested withdrawals. As long as the withdrawals didn't exceed the incoming investments, Madoff's empire could survive. But Madoff's reliance on constant cash flow was also the scheme's greatest weakness. The moment the demand for withdrawals outpaced the inflow of new investments, the entire operation was at risk of collapse. This delicate balance was the foundation of the Ponzi scheme's survival. When financial markets began to falter during the 2008 financial crisis, and more clients started asking for their money back, Madoff couldn't keep the cash spigot running anymore. The pressure mounted, and eventually it became impossible to continue the charade. This chapter also explores the psychology of Madoff's victims, who often chose to believe in the illusion despite occasional warning signs. Many investors received suspiciously consistent returns, even in volatile markets, but because Madoff had built such a strong reputation, they ignored their doubts. The desire for stable, predictable profits made them complicit in their own downfall, as they failed to perform the necessary due diligence. Can you relate to this? Always demand transparency and be cautious of secrecy. If someone refuses to disclose details about where your money is being invested or how returns are generated, that's a major red flag. Consistent, high returns with little explanation or verification are often signs of fraud. Be proactive in demanding detailed information and third-party audits. In Chapter 6, What They Wanted to Believe. The sixth chapter takes a deep dive into the psychology of Madoff's victims, examining how and why they allowed themselves to be deceived for so long. Madoff's genius lay not just in his fraudulent schemes, but in his understanding of human nature. He knew exactly what his investors wanted, and he gave it to them. Consistent, above-market returns that were just believable enough to keep people hooked. Investors, from small-time individuals to billionaires, were not just in it for the money, they were in it for the prestige. Madoff created an aura of exclusivity around his fund, making people feel that investing with him was a privilege. Many investors had to be introduced by a friend or connection, and Madoff was known to turn potential clients away, further enhancing his mystique. The sense that they were part of an elite circle blinded many to the fact that their investments were not backed by any real returns. The chapter explains how Madoff's victims often ignored the inconsistencies because they wanted to believe the dream. Some knew there were risks or warning signs, like the lack of transparency and refusal to allow external audits, but they convinced themselves that Madoff's reputation was enough. They trusted his image as a pillar of Wall Street, a former chairman of NASDAQ, and a man with deep ties to the financial elite. The returns they received were the perfect confirmation of the illusion. At the heart of this chapter is a sobering realization. Madoff's victims were not simply ignorant or gullible. They were actively complicit in their own deception because they chose to believe in the fantasy he sold them. Their desire for easy, consistent profits outweighed their responsibility to question how those returns were generated. Don't let the allure of exclusivity and prestige blind you to reality. Scammers often create an illusion of special access to draw in victims. No matter how successful someone appears or how many respected names are attached, always question the basis of their success. Demand transparency, and if the answers are vague or evasive, don't ignore the red flags. Going over Chapter 7, Warning Signs. Chapter 7 peels back the layers of Madoff's scheme to reveal the numerous warning signs that were overlooked by regulators, investors, and even some financial professionals who suspected something was amiss. Madoff's entire operation was riddled with inconsistencies and red flags, yet he managed to avoid detection for decades. This chapter illustrates the dangerous consequences of ignoring the signs when something doesn't add up. One of the major red flags was Madoff's refusal to allow independent audits of his investment advisory business. Despite managing billions of dollars, Madoff operated his firm with a shocking level of secrecy. He claimed that his strategy was proprietary and too complex to share with others, which should have raised serious questions among his investors. In any legitimate investment operation, transparency and third-party verification are essential. But Madoff used his reputation and charm to dismiss these concerns, convincing his clients that they didn't need to know the details. Another glaring warning sign was the consistency of his returns. Madoff's fund produced steady profits year after year, regardless of market conditions. This level of consistency was practically impossible, especially during volatile times like the 2008 financial crisis, when many hedge funds were suffering heavy losses. While many investors were thrilled with their profits, a few brave voices like Harry Markopolos raised concerns about the legitimacy of Madoff's returns. Markopolos, a financial analyst, famously tried to alert the SEC to Madoff's fraud years before it came to light, calculating that Madoff's strategy was mathematically impossible. But the regulators, too, failed to act. The SEC investigated Madoff multiple times, but never dug deep enough to uncover the fraud. In part, this was due to Madoff's stature in the industry. He was a Wall Street legend, and many regulators simply couldn't believe that someone with his reputation could be running a fraud on such a massive scale. Madoff's reputation shielded him from scrutiny, and his ability to manipulate those around him allowed him to continue his scheme for years. This chapter highlights how powerful the combination of greed and deception can be. Madoff's victims, regulators, and even competitors ignored or dismissed clear warning signs because they either trusted Madoff too much or didn't want to believe that such a respected figure could be capable of such treachery. So, what are the key takeaways from this? Never ignore red flags, no matter how minor they seem. Whether it's a lack of transparency, suspiciously consistent returns, or a reluctance to answer questions, these are all signs that something may be wrong. It's better to walk away from a potential opportunity than to risk everything by ignoring warning signs. Madoff's fraud victims weren't tricked by complex financial jargon or impenetrable strategies. They were tricked because they wanted to believe. They trusted him because his operation appeared exclusive and his reputation seemed untouchable. But behind the curtain, the signs were there for anyone willing to look closely. These chapters emphasize a universal truth about scams. They often rely on complicity, on the victim's willingness to suspend disbelief and ignore the obvious in pursuit of gain. Madoff understood human nature all too well, using people's desires and fears against them to fuel his Ponzi scheme. Now, onto Chapter 8, a near-death experience. In Chapter 8, we see Bernie Madoff's empire reaching a tipping point, teetering on the edge of collapse. The 2008 financial crisis sent shockwaves through global markets, shaking the foundations of financial institutions everywhere. For most investors, it was a time of great uncertainty and loss. For Bernie Madoff, it was a near-death experience for his fraudulent empire. As the markets tanked, Madoff was faced with an unprecedented number of redemption requests. Investors, panicking as they saw the market crash, wanted their money back. But here's the catch. Madoff's Ponzi scheme wasn't built on real returns, only the illusion of them. The cash that had kept the Ponzi scheme alive for decades was dwindling fast, and Madoff was running out of new investors to pay off the old ones. It was the classic Ponzi problem, and Madoff knew it all too well. Without new money coming in, the entire scheme would implode. Despite his outward composure, the pressure was mounting internally. For decades, Madoff had been able to manage his fraudulent empire by carefully balancing the inflow of new money with the outflow of returns. But now, the global financial crisis meant fewer people were investing, and the redemptions were outpacing the new deposits. Madoff realized the jig was almost up. Yet, what's remarkable in this chapter is how Madoff, ever the master manipulator, continued to maintain his calm, controlled facade. To his clients and colleagues, nothing appeared out of the ordinary. He reassured investors that everything was under control, even as the walls of his empire were crumbling. This chapter reveals Madoff's extraordinary ability to compartmentalize the collapse of his scheme while carrying on with the routine of a successful financier. Financial crises often expose fraud. Economic downturns can reveal the cracks in schemes that depend on constant cash flow. When the tide goes out, as Warren Buffett famously said, you find out who's been swimming naked. During tough times, it's crucial to monitor the people and institutions handling your money even more closely. Beware of sudden excuses for delays or refusal of withdrawals, as these can signal deeper issues. Moving on to Chapter 9, Madoff's World. Chapter 9 gives us a window into Bernie Madoff's private world. The man behind the mask, the contradictions in his personality, and the carefully crafted world he constructed to maintain his image. Here, we see Madoff's life as a performance, where everything was curated to enhance his reputation as a financial genius. His family, home life, social circles, and the office all played their part in sustaining the illusion. Madoff's world was not just one of wealth, but of carefully cultivated status. He lived in a penthouse in Manhattan, owned a beach house in Montauk, and rubbed shoulders with the most elite figures in society. From Wall Street power players to celebrities, Madoff's network gave him a cloak of credibility. His proximity to wealth and his willingness to give generously to charitable causes further solidified his image as a successful, philanthropic businessman. But this chapter goes beyond the wealth and glamour. It examines Madoff's personal relationships, particularly with his family. His sons, Mark and Andrew, worked for the legitimate side of the Madoff business, running the brokerage firm. His wife Ruth was deeply involved in social and philanthropic circles. To them, and to the outside world, Bernie was the epitome of success. But what we learn in this chapter is how compartmentalized his life truly was. His family remained largely in the dark about the true nature of his business. He was able to live two lives: a loving, supportive father and husband, and the architect of the largest financial fraud in history. The chapter also delves into Madoff's secretive business practices, especially the operations on the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building, where his fraudulent investment advisory business was headquartered. Only a handful of trusted employees had access to this floor. The strict separation of operations allowed Madoff to keep the Ponzi scheme isolated from the rest of his business. Employees on the legitimate side of the brokerage firm had no idea what was happening on the floor below. Madoff's ability to keep these two worlds separate is one of the most striking elements of his fraud. His double life was key to his success, but it also highlights the mental and emotional toll of living a lie. Madoff once confessed that he knew, as far back as the 1990s, that the Ponzi scheme would eventually implode. Yet he continued, driven by an inability to stop and the overwhelming fear of being exposed. This chapter paints a portrait of a man who, despite his outward success, was trapped in a web of his own making, unable to admit failure, yet knowing that the collapse was inevitable. Fraudsters often live double lives. They thrive by separating their public image from their private misdeeds. Be cautious when dealing with individuals or firms that are overly secretive about parts of their business operations. Transparency should be the foundation of any relationship involving trust and money. If certain areas of a business are off limits or unexplained, it's a red flag that shouldn't be ignored. The tension between illusion and reality. These chapters delve into the tension between Madoff's carefully constructed illusion of success and the crumbling reality of his fraudulent empire. They provide a detailed look at the psychological and operational tactics Madoff used to keep his Ponzi scheme alive for decades. His ability to manipulate both the flow of cash and the perception of his success was extraordinary, but it also highlights the fragility of such a deceitful enterprise. On one hand, Madoff obtained a serene facade. His world of wealth, prestige, and success appeared unshakable. On the other hand, the financial crisis exposed the underlying cracks, and the constant demand for cash threatened to bring the whole scheme crashing down. Yet Madoff remained calm and composed, expertly concealing the reality of his fraud from the people closest to him. 1. Watch for secrecy in business practices. Madoff's success depended on maintaining a strict separation between his fraudulent investment advisory business and his legitimate brokerage. Lack of transparency or areas of a business that seem off-limits should always be a red flag. 2. Crisis reveals the truth. Economic downturns or moments of financial stress often reveal the underlying weaknesses in fraudulent schemes. If an investment or financial operation begins showing signs of strain during a crisis, it may indicate deeper problems. 3. Beware of the double life. Fraudsters like Madoff often maintain a public image of trustworthiness and success while hiding their true intentions. Don't let charisma or status cloud your judgment. Always verify through facts and transparency rather than relying on someone's reputation alone. Let's now explore chapters 10 and 11 of The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust. These chapters offer a closer look at the chaotic, nerve-wracking final year of Madoff's scheme and the dramatic aftermath of his confession, as the full extent of his fraud came to light. They bring us into the heart of Madoff's collapse and its devastating impact on victims who had trusted him for decades. Let's look at Chapter 10, The Year of Living Dangerously. In Chapter 10, we find ourselves in the harrowing final stretch of Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme, the year 2008. For decades, Madoff had carefully kept his fraudulent empire afloat by balancing the inflow of new investments with the demands for redemptions. However, as the global financial crisis deepened, the walls began closing in on him. Madoff's downfall started subtly, as the demand for withdrawals surged. Institutions that had long trusted him, like the Spanish banks and the Italian-run Kingate funds, were now asking to pull their money out. The more they withdrew, the harder it became for Madoff to keep up appearances. He had always depended on a constant flow of new investors to cover redemptions, but as the crisis continued, new money was drying up. It was a critical moment where Madoff was faced with the impossible, balancing his false promises with a rapidly vanishing pool of resources. What is most striking about this chapter is Madoff's mindset during this period. Even as the pressure mounted and the fraud became unsustainable, he maintained an outward image of calm and control. He continued to attend charity board meetings, rub shoulders with the financial elite, and present himself as the steady hand in the midst of market chaos. In one instance, Madoff chaired a meeting for the Gift of Life Bone Marrow Foundation, where he discussed fundraising efforts as though nothing was amiss. This ability to compartmentalize his looming disaster from his public life was one of Madoff's most chilling traits. Behind the scenes, however, Madoff was desperately trying to hold it all together. His calls with close associates became more frantic as he attempted to reassure them that he could handle the wave of redemptions. He knew he couldn't, but he was still unwilling to let the charade fall apart just yet. He kept bluffing, hoping against hope that something, anything, would turn the tide in his favor. But by mid-December 2008, Madoff was trapped, and there was no way out. This chapter illustrates the extraordinary lengths to which Madoff went to preserve the illusion of success, even as his scheme was collapsing. His arrogance and refusal to admit failure only deepened the damage, both to his investors and to his own psyche. Some of the key lessons here include: pay close attention to market turbulence. It often reveals hidden weaknesses. During financial crises, fraudsters are often exposed because they can no longer sustain their schemes when liquidity dries up. Keep a close watch on investment managers during times of crisis. Sudden evasiveness or an inability to provide clear answers should raise immediate red flags. Now, Chapter 11, Waking Up in the Rubble. Chapter 11 brings us to the day after Madoff's confession, when the devastating reality of his fraud began to sink in. For the thousands of investors who had trusted him, Madoff's arrest was more than just a financial catastrophe. It was a personal betrayal on an unprecedented scale. People who had thought their futures were secure, thanks to Madoff's steady returns, now faced the horrifying truth that their wealth had been based on lies. This chapter vividly captures the shock and disbelief that rippled through Madoff's client base. Many of his investors were not just clients, they were personal friends, family members, and people who had known and trusted him for decades. Their lives were intertwined with his in deep, personal ways. For them, the betrayal was not just financial, it was emotional and psychological. They had trusted Madoff with their life savings, their children's college funds, and their charitable donations, only to learn that everything had been stolen. One of the most heart-wrenching aspects of this chapter is the stories of retirees who had invested everything with Madoff, believing they were set for life. Many of them, having relied solely on Madoff's returns for their income, now found themselves destitute. Charities that had placed their endowments with Madoff were also hit hard, as funds they depended on to continue their work disappeared overnight. The realization of the scope of the fraud was staggering. On the day of Madoff's arrest, he had been managing roughly $65 billion in assets on paper, but in reality, almost none of that money existed. The chapter paints a grim picture of how people woke up to find their financial worlds reduced to rubble. Not only were they financially ruined, but they were also entangled in legal battles, trying to recover what little remained. The legal and emotional aftermath of Madoff's confession was equally complex. The Securities Investor Protection Corporation, SIPC, immediately took over Madoff's firm and began the long, painful process of attempting to recover assets for defrauded investors. However, the process was slow and incomplete. Many of Madoff's victims would never recover more than a fraction of their losses, if anything at all. The psychological toll on Madoff's victims was profound. Some, like French aristocrat and hedge fund manager René Thierry Magon de la Villouche, took their own lives after realizing the full extent of their losses. Others, left devastated and without the financial means to rebuild their lives, slipped into depression or isolation. This chapter is a poignant reminder of the human cost of financial fraud beyond just numbers on a balance sheet. From what we've learned, diversification is essential. The investors most devastated by Madoff's fraud were those who had entrusted their entire savings to him. Diversifying your investments across different platforms, asset classes, and managers is critical to minimizing risk and protecting yourself from total loss in case of fraud or failure. The collapse and its aftermath, chapters 10 and 11, reveal the human cost of Madoff's deceit, from the terrifying last days of his scheme to the utter devastation that followed his confession. These chapters also highlight how Madoff, despite the enormity of his fraud, was able to maintain the appearance of a trusted, successful financial advisor, even as his empire crumbled. His ability to compartmentalize, to continue projecting confidence while his world fell apart, is a chilling reminder of the power of deception. The emotional and financial toll on his victims is laid bare in chapter 11. These were not just numbers on paper. Real lives were shattered, families were torn apart, and some never recovered from the emotional blow of being betrayed by someone they trusted completely. The ripple effects of Madoff's collapse extended far beyond the financial markets, leaving a trail of broken lives and broken trust. Chapters 10 and 11 take us through the darkest moments of Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. The frantic last year as he tried to hold the fraud together, and the devastating aftermath of his confession. These chapters are a sobering reminder of the immense damage that can be done when trust is betrayed on such a massive scale. Madoff's fraud didn't just cost people their money, it cost them their faith in others, their financial futures, and in some cases, their lives. So what can we take away from these chapters? 1. Stay alert during financial crises. Economic downturns often reveal hidden weaknesses in businesses and investments. Fraudsters can't survive without new money, so sudden withdrawal restrictions or unexplained delays should be immediate red flags. 2. Diversify your investments. Madoff's victims were hit hardest because they trusted him with all their money. Spread your investments across different sectors and managers to reduce your exposure to fraud or failure. 3. Trust, but verify. The aftermath of Madoff's confession showed how easily trust can be shattered when it is misplaced. Always demand transparency, regular audits, and clear communication from anyone managing your money. Alright, now, Let's dive into chapters 12 and 13 of The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust, where we confront the financial wreckage left behind by Madoff's Ponzi scheme. These chapters detail the complex process of reckoning the damage done to thousands of investors, along with the legal battles and emotional scars that followed. They also explore the division between those who lost everything and the net winners who walked away with profits, highlighting the deep moral and financial implications of the fallout. In Chapter 12, Reckoning the Damage. Chapter 12 takes us into the heart of the post-Madoff chaos. After his confession in December 2008, the financial world struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the damage he caused. The unraveling of the scheme left over 4,800 claims from investors who had poured their savings into Madoff's fraudulent empire. The numbers were staggering, about $65 billion in reported losses, including both the principal amounts and the fake profits that Madoff had promised over the years. This chapter details the Herculean task of trying to recover the stolen funds. The Securities Investor Protection Corporation, SIPC, was appointed to clean up the mess. Irving Picard, a trustee appointed by the courts, was given the near-impossible task of locating any remaining assets that could be used to repay the defrauded investors. However, Picard quickly discovered that there was little left. Madoff had kept the illusion going by shuffling money between accounts, but most of the actual capital had already been spent. The legal and moral complexity of the situation unfolded as Picard began filing lawsuits to claw back money from those who had profited from Madoff's scheme, so-called net winners. These were investors who had withdrawn more money than they had originally invested, unknowingly benefiting from the fraud, while others were left with nothing. Clawback lawsuits became a controversial yet necessary part of the recovery process. Investors who thought they had walked away with legitimate profits now found themselves being sued to return those gains, as the trustee argued that they had been paid with stolen money. The chapter also sheds light on how difficult it was to untangle the intricate web of lies Madoff had spun. His records were incomplete, often fabricated, making it incredibly challenging to track where all the money had gone. Many victims, particularly smaller individual investors, were left in financial ruin. Some had lost their entire life savings, and while others had at least recovered a portion of their original investment, the psychological damage was deep. One of the most striking aspects of this chapter is how many of Madoff's victims were forced to accept that they would never fully recover their losses. Even though some funds were eventually distributed to victims, the process was slow, and the amounts recovered were just a fraction of what had been lost. Picard's efforts to claw back funds resulted in several billion dollars being returned, but for many, it was too little, too late. Understand the protections, or lack thereof, surrounding your investments. This chapter emphasizes the importance of knowing the regulatory protections available when investing, such as the role of the SIPC in securities fraud cases. But even those protections have limits. As Madoff's victims discovered, always make sure your investments are insured or protected by credible financial institutions, and never assume that high returns will come without risk. Chapter 13. Net Winners and Net Losers. Chapter 13 takes a deep dive into the concept of net winners and net losers, a term that took on profound importance in the aftermath of Madoff's scheme. As the dust settled, it became clear that not everyone had lost money in Madoff's fraudulent investment business. Some had unknowingly profited by withdrawing more than they had originally invested. These net winners, however, would soon find themselves facing legal challenges as Picard and his team sought to recover funds to redistribute to those who had lost everything. The chapter reveals how the clawback lawsuits aimed to right a moral wrong, but created a new wave of anguish for those who thought they had escaped financial ruin. Imagine believing that you had dodged the Madoff disaster, only to receive a legal notice informing you that the money you thought was rightfully yours had to be returned. These lawsuits targeted people who had made substantial withdrawals before the scheme collapsed, many of whom had no idea that their profits had come from newer investors rather than legitimate returns. The legal battles that ensued were fierce. Many net winners fought back, arguing that they had acted in good faith and that they were just as much victims of Madoff's deceit as the net losers. For these individuals, the realization that their financial security was built on a house of cards was devastating. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the psychological toll of being unwittingly complicit in a massive fraud. The chapter also paints a vivid picture of the complexities of fairness in such a situation. On one hand, clawback lawsuits were necessary to provide some level of restitution to those who had lost everything. On the other hand, many net winners, especially small-time investors who had withdrawn their money for personal expenses, were now being asked to return funds they had already spent. One example in the chapter is the case of Jeffrey Piekauer, one of Madoff's largest investors and a major net winner. Over the years, Piekauer had withdrawn billions of dollars in fake profits, making him one of the biggest beneficiaries of Madoff's fraud. After Madoff's arrest, Piekauer became the focus of intense legal scrutiny, and his estate eventually agreed to pay back over $7 billion in a settlement, the largest of any individual involved in the scheme. This marked a significant victory for Picard's team, but it also underscored the enormous sums involved and the moral ambiguity surrounding the issue. What becomes clear in this chapter is the deep divide between those who were wiped out and those who had managed to withdraw money before the collapse. While some of the clawback efforts were successful, the process was long, painful, and fraught with legal complications. Many of the net winners, particularly those with smaller profits, were forced to settle or return money they had long since spent. To consider some lessons here. Withdraw early, but diversify your investments. The concept of net winners and losers shows how withdrawing early from an investment can sometimes shield you from future losses. However, as Madoff's case demonstrates, even those who pulled out in time weren't entirely safe. The lesson here is twofold. First, be cautious about consistently high returns and consider taking profits off the table periodically. Second, never rely on a single investment for your financial security. Diversify your portfolio to minimize risk. Navigating the complex fallout, chapters 12 and 13 of The Wizard of Lies deal with the aftermath of Bernie Madoff's scheme, revealing the complexities of trying to repair the financial damage caused by one of the largest frauds in history. For Madoff's victims, the road to recovery was anything but smooth. Many found themselves entangled in lawsuits, whether as net losers seeking restitution or net winners being forced to return ill-gotten gains. The ripple effects of the fraud extended far beyond the financial losses, leaving deep emotional scars and years of legal battles. These chapters also underscore the moral dilemma of trying to balance fairness with financial recovery. Clawback lawsuits were necessary to try and restore some justice to the victims, but they also created new layers of suffering for those who had thought they had escaped financial ruin. Chapters 12 and 13 paint a sobering picture of the legal and emotional fallout from Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. The process of reckoning the damage wasn't just about financial recovery. It was about untangling a web of deceit that had left countless lives in ruin. For the net losers, the road to recovery was long and painful, while for the net winners, the revelation that their profits had come at the expense of others was a harsh blow. Some takeaways to consider here are: 1. Clawback lawsuits highlight the complexities of recovering stolen funds. Even those who profited from Madoff's scheme were not safe from legal action. Understanding where your returns come from and the legality behind them is crucial. 2. Diversification remains key. Many of Madoff's victims had placed all their financial eggs in his basket, and when it collapsed, they lost everything. Diversifying your investments across different asset classes and financial institutions can provide a safeguard against total loss. 3. Beware of too-good-to-be-true profits. Consistently high returns, particularly during volatile market periods, should be treated with caution. Always verify how those profits are generated and take periodic withdrawals to protect yourself from future losses. Moving on. Let's explore chapters 14 to 16 of The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust, which bring us into the heart of the Madoff family's suffering, the relentless pursuit of justice, and the search for hope in the aftermath of unimaginable betrayal. These final chapters grapple with the personal, legal, and emotional consequences of Madoff's fraud as the world comes to terms with the enormity of the devastation he left behind. On Chapter 14, The Sins of the Father. Chapter 14 paints a heartbreaking picture of how Madoff's crimes shattered not just the lives of his investors, but also his own family. The chapter opens with a chilling question. How could Bernie Madoff's closest relatives not have known? Many people found it hard to believe that Madoff's wife, Ruth, and their two sons, Mark and Andrew, had no idea about the colossal fraud that Bernie was running. Madoff's sons had worked with him at the legitimate side of his business, the brokerage firm. However, Madoff kept his Ponzi scheme strictly confined to a separate area, with only a select few employees knowing the full extent of his deception. According to the chapter, when Madoff finally confessed to his sons on December 10, 2008, their lives were thrown into chaos. They immediately reported him to the authorities, setting the stage for his arrest the following day. But their decision to turn their father in did little to shield them from the suspicion and public outcry that followed. This chapter dives deeply into the profound emotional toll on Madoff's family, particularly his sons. Mark and Andrew, who had worked so hard to establish careers in their own right, were now irrevocably tainted by their father's actions. Their mother, Ruth, faced the impossible challenge of reconciling her loyalty to her husband with the staggering truth of his crimes. The family became pariahs overnight. Ruth was shunned by society, and the brothers struggled to distance themselves from their father's legacy of betrayal. The impact on the Madoff family was nothing short of tragic. In 2010, just 2 years after Madoff's arrest, Mark Madoff took his own life on the second anniversary of his father's confession. His suicide sent shockwaves through the Madoff family, casting a dark shadow over the already painful fallout. Andrew, too, was deeply affected, and he later died from cancer in 2014. Both sons went to their graves, insisting they knew nothing about their father's Ponzi scheme, but the burden of public suspicion weighed heavily on them. Ruth, who had stood by Bernie through it all, eventually distanced herself from him, but she remained deeply conflicted. The chapter portrays her as a woman trapped between love for her husband and the horrific betrayal he inflicted on their family and countless others. Family and reputation can be caught in the crossfire of financial crime. Madoff's case is a stark reminder that fraud doesn't just harm investors, it can destroy families. For those involved in financial ventures, transparency and open communication are vital, not only for business but also for personal relationships. When deceit becomes a way of life, the consequences extend far beyond the fraud itself. Let's review Chapter 15, The Wheels of Justice. In Chapter 15, we follow the relentless pursuit of justice as the legal system grappled with the enormity of Madoff's crimes. While Bernie Madoff had been sentenced to 150 years in prison, the fight for justice was far from over. The chapter explores the complexity of prosecuting a crime of this magnitude, as investigators work tirelessly to hold everyone involved accountable. This chapter offers a detailed look at the various legal proceedings that followed Madoff's arrest. One of the key figures in this pursuit of justice was Irving Picard, the court-appointed trustee responsible for recovering stolen funds and returning them to defrauded investors. Picard and his team faced a daunting task. They had to comb through decades of financial records, untangle Madoff's web of deceit, and track down assets that could be reclaimed. The legal battle extended far beyond Madoff himself. Picard filed lawsuits against financial institutions, feeder funds, and individuals who had profited from Madoff's Ponzi scheme, accusing them of turning a blind eye to the obvious red flags. These legal battles were long and complicated, with many arguing that they had been duped by Madoff, just like his other investors. Some settlements were reached, resulting in billions of dollars being returned to victims, but the process was slow and painstaking. The chapter also highlights the difficulty of holding the right people accountable. While many smaller investors lost everything, some of Madoff's larger clients, including prominent financial institutions, were able to recoup their losses by suing third parties. This disparity in the recovery process deepened the divide between Madoff's victims, with many feeling that justice was unevenly served. At the same time, the emotional toll on Madoff's victims became increasingly evident. For many, the legal battles provided little solace. They wanted more than just financial restitution. They wanted to see everyone who had enabled Madoff's fraud brought to justice. Yet, the legal process was frustratingly slow, and the complexity of the case made it difficult to assign clear blame beyond Madoff himself. The chapter leaves readers with a sobering reminder of the limitations of the justice system when it comes to large-scale financial crimes. While some level of restitution was achieved, the emotional and psychological damage inflicted on Madoff's victims was impossible to quantify. Key lesson: the pursuit of justice in financial crimes is long and complex. While the legal system can work to recover stolen funds, the process is often slow and incomplete. For investors, understanding the legal protections and recourse available to you is essential. It's also important to remember that justice in financial fraud cases doesn't always mean full recovery, especially when the damage extends beyond finances to personal trust and emotional well-being. Finally, Chapter 16, Hope, Lost and Found. The final chapter, Chapter 16, shifts the focus from the wreckage of Madoff's crimes to the search for hope and recovery. As victims came to terms with their losses, many struggled to rebuild their lives. But amid the devastation, some found ways to move forward, learning from the experience and seeking solace in community and resilience. This chapter presents stories of survivors, those who, despite losing everything, refused to let Madoff's crimes define their futures. Some victims banded together to form support groups, sharing their experiences and offering emotional support to one another. These groups provided a vital source of comfort, helping victims to process their trauma and begin the slow process of healing. One of the most poignant aspects of this chapter is the emphasis on rebuilding trust. For many of Madoff's victims, the emotional damage caused by his betrayal was far greater than the financial loss. They had placed their trust in him, often based on personal relationships, and that trust had been shattered. Rebuilding that sense of security and faith in others was one of the greatest challenges they faced. However, the chapter also highlights moments of redemption and recovery. Some victims, though financially ruined, found strength in their ability to move on and rebuild their lives from the ground up. They learned hard lessons about financial vigilance, but more importantly, they rediscovered their capacity for resilience and hope. For Madoff's family, the process of recovery was far more complicated. Ruth, who had been so closely tied to her husband's life and reputation, remained largely isolated from society. While she cut ties with Bernie after his conviction, the shadow of his crimes continued to follow her. For the Madoff sons, hope was more elusive. Mark's suicide and Andrew's death from cancer brought a tragic end to their stories, leaving behind a legacy of pain. The chapter ends on a reflective note, considering the broader lessons of the Madoff scandal. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of blind trust, the importance of financial literacy, and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. What can we draw from this? Hope and recovery are possible, even in the face of profound betrayal. Financial fraud can strip people of their savings, but it doesn't have to strip them of their resilience. The Madoff victims who found hope did so by connecting with others, rebuilding their trust in humanity, and learning from their experiences. The chapter reminds us that even in the darkest moments, there is always a path to recovery, though it may be long and difficult. Chapters 14 to 16 bring the story of Bernie Madoff's fraud to a close, but they also leave us with enduring lessons about the human cost of financial crime. From the destruction of the Madoff family to the long, complicated pursuit of justice, these chapters remind us of the emotional and psychological toll that fraud can take on victims, families, and society. Yet, amid the devastation, we also find stories of hope and resilience. Victims who lost everything found ways to rebuild, and even as they grappled with the betrayal, many discovered new strength in their ability to overcome adversity. Some notable takeaways. 1. Fraud impacts families as deeply as investors. Madoff's crimes didn't just ruin his investors, they destroyed his family. Transparency in financial matters is not just a professional obligation but a personal one as well. The ripple effects of deceit can devastate the people closest to you. Justice is complex and often incomplete. While legal processes work to return stolen funds and punish the guilty, full justice is rarely achieved in cases of financial fraud. Emotional wounds are harder to heal, and the legal process is often slow and frustrating. 3. Hope and resilience are vital in the aftermath of fraud. Though financial ruin can be overwhelming, Madoff's victims showed that recovery, emotional and even financial, is possible. Those who came together to support one another found strength in community, and many learned to rebuild their lives with newfound caution and awareness. The chapter underscores the importance of facing adversity with resilience and the potential to find hope, even in the darkest circumstances. Some lessons for the future. As these final chapters bring us to the end of The Wizard of Lies, we're left not just with a story of massive financial fraud, but with a deeper understanding of the emotional and psychological costs of betrayal. Bernie Madoff's crimes destroyed families, friendships, and lives. His victims range from billionaire hedge fund managers to middle-class retirees, all of whom trusted him implicitly. Yet the lasting lesson of these chapters is one of vigilance, resilience, and the need to stay informed. The Madoff scandal serves as a powerful reminder that even the most trusted individuals can betray that trust, and even the most stable-seeming financial ventures can collapse without warning. But for those who survived the wreckage, the path forward wasn't just about recovering lost money. It was about recovering lost faith and learning to navigate the financial world with a stronger sense of caution and skepticism. Chapters 14 to 16 bring a poignant end to the saga of Bernie Madoff, shedding light on both the personal tragedies and the broader implications of his crimes. These chapters emphasize the devastating toll that financial fraud can take, not just on victims' bank accounts, but on their relationships, mental health, and trust in the world. Yet through stories of hope and recovery, we are reminded that even in the face of profound betrayal, the human spirit can endure and rebuild. Vigilance, diversification, and emotional resilience are the best defenses against future fraud. No matter how trusted or successful someone appears, financial oversight and accountability are critical. But beyond financial strategies, it's essential to build the emotional fortitude to bounce back from even the worst crises. Because as Madoff's victims showed, hope can always be found, even in the ruins. As we close our deep dive into The Wizard of Lies, Bernie Madoff and the Death of Trust, the story of Bernie Madoff serves as a sobering reminder of how trust, when misplaced, can lead to devastating consequences. Madoff's Ponzi scheme wasn't just about financial greed. It exploited human nature, our desires for security, exclusivity, and consistent success. The lessons here are powerful, and they extend far beyond the financial world. Some of them include: never place blind trust in any individual or institution. Always ask the hard questions, demand transparency, and verify where your money is going. Diversify your investments. Madoff's victims lost everything because they trusted him with all of their money. Spread your investments across different asset classes and managers to reduce your risk. Be skeptical of consistent high returns. If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. Madoff lured people in with promises of stable, high returns, even in volatile markets, something no legitimate investment can guarantee. Stay informed. Understand the protections that exist in the financial systems you use, and always be aware of the latest scams or fraud tactics. Through applying these lessons to your financial life, you can protect yourself from falling into the traps that have ensnared so many others. If you found value in this video, please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to A Journey in Perception for more insightful book summaries like this one. Be sure to turn on notifications so you never miss our latest uploads. And we want to hear from you. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on some notable schemes that has either you, someone you know, or your community, and what are ways you think people out other can stay alert and safe. Also, let us know which books you'd love to see summarized next. Thank you for watching, and remember, wisdom comes not just from reading, but from applying what we've learned to everyday life. Stay sharp, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next video.